I have so much to learn about everything. I pretty much don't know about everything. But I think about existence a lot. I think about the everything that I know a lot. And one of the things I want to get to in this video is the idea of, because we think of history as this progression, yet there's a certain kind of atemporality to this progression. Because we think of what our ancestors did. We always claim the good works of our ancestors, We always claim for ourselves, or it seems in popular vernacular, in popular speech, in popular, these days, podcasting, before in popular script. It seems as though we claim for ourselves the achievements of our age, even if we had nothing to do with them. Isaac Newton, Leibniz, they knew more about calculus several hundred years ago than I know today. Never mind what they knew about religion, philosophy, alchemy, etc. And code breaking, famously Isaac Newton broke down the Greek mythologies into alchemy and was able to decipher the symbolism of the mythologies into alchemy and actually produce legitimate chemistry that not only can be but is being replicated today, right? Yeah, I'm not there. So even though he came before me, I exist before him. Or rather, he exists closer to eternity than I do after him. Now, who else could I pick? I could pick in the line of physics. I could pick, I briefly took physics in college for, a semester, half a semester, 3/4 of a semester. So, I could pick the lab instructor and say, well, that guy's closer to Newton than I am. Or I could pick a student today in that guy's class and say, that person, Newton and whoever this guy is, who's younger than me, they both exist before me and after me. They dwarf my knowledge. Alright, this is a bad example. Let me try to get to a better one. I always think of Sejong the Great. To me, Sejong the Great, historically, insofar as we can prove, and people always harsh on people who talk about pseudo-history or pseudo-science, but for instance, Alexander the Great is pretty much considered a historical figure by most people. And it doesn't matter what's in the fucking scientific articles. This is one thing everybody has to get through their minds, and people don't talk about it. But it is a very big piece of the truth. What condenses upon the accumulated knowledge of peoples? What condenses? What infiltrates is the collection of the truth. What most resonates, what story, what song, what philosophy, what argument, whatever that is that most resonates with the most amount of people, and there are several, we are this combination of these resonances because we inhabit We inhabit this storyland, or this storyland inhabits us. And those stories, those fables, those parables, those truths, those arguments, yet there's no unified theory expressed. Therefore, being as though symbolically, within the symbology of numbers, within the symbology of the physical sciences, within the symbology of linguistics and narrative structures and writing styles, within the consensus of history. Like, there's still not a unified theory. There are competing narratives, stories, theories, compositions, structures that vie for dominance within the accepted priesthood of academia. Yes, that all exists, right? But even within the accepted priesthoods of academia, of the church, of government, or even just the social sphere or the blogosphere. Like, there's all these accepted dominant structures, yet there's no completely unified theory. And certainly not within, like, physics and science. So, in a sense, and it's not to be a skeptic for skepticism's sake. It's to be a skeptic for the sake of truth. It's not to be a doubter to doubt all the way down to where nothing is. It's to be a doubter to doubt all the false truths all the way down to where the truth is. And saying that is to say we shouldn't hate false truths, but we should, like, transgress, transcribe, transcend false truths. We should climb false truths. All these false truths, all these false prophets, because people always talk about, like, prophets versus false prophets. And you don't understand. Like, if you're trying to say, oh, this was a prophet, this was a false prophet. False prophets are prophets. False prophets really see shit in the future. You can be a false prophet and fucking nail something down. Hammer. Call it out. So, whether or not, and charlatans and so on, that's a whole nother gig. Like, the charlatans, the con artists, those aren't false prophets. Those are charlatans and con artists. False prophets are prophets, just as prophets are prophets. They can tell the truth of the future. False prophets, if you consider time a sphere, or if you consider it a coil on a tube collapsed to a sphere, so it looks like it's just going around, but really it's this tube progressing, which in different geometries, including perspective, would be a spiral, and so on. But if, to make it simple, we consider it a circle, false prophets cut chords through time and don't hit the center. Real prophets hit the center. And the real prophets, or the archangels, don't need cut diameters through that center of the circle, but they can hit the center and go anywhere. So, even false prophets make good prophecy. It's just maybe their conclusions aren't correct. So what I was going to say about Sejong the Great, who was, I mean, Sejong the Great, and what's super important about it, and it's like, oh well, he was lucky because because of history as it is. Like, so we have all these legends and these mythologies, right? About things that we can't yet, even though all these archaeological things keep coming up that like give insight and so on to myths. You know, Midas's tomb. Midas's tomb is a big one, especially considering those fucking goblets with the fucking point in the middle and the bracts coming up the side. I'll get to that some other time. But I mean that's what it's all about. But getting the conclusion wrong. The power of morality. So what I was going to say about Sejong the Great was like, he created at one point in time. At one point in time, he and those surrounding him created the Korean language. I've gone on about it before. Watch my other shit. One of the things I didn't mention was that Sejong the Great created the Korean language. One of the reasons he decided, I mean, it was Chinese language, a bunch of illiterate people in Korea, you know, 1500s, 15th century, whatever, I get you confused, but half a millennia ago, roughly, this dude was like, I don't give, I mean, not only, I mean, he still ran a successful empire, country, clan. But like, he's like, I'm creating a new language, and he took years to develop it. And he wrote like a few pages. So here's a king who writes a few pages, and the scholars that surround him write like 20, 30 something more pages. So you got this text that's like 20, 30, 40 pages long. This booklet, this pamphlet, right? We're all familiar with pamphlets and the effect of pamphlets over time. This dude makes it his life's work to make a pamphlet, to make a language, to make his people literate. And one of the biggest reasons why he made this, why Sejong the Great created, the only person in history that we have documentation for, the only person in history that we even know of who is like, you know, besides Tolkien or besides John Dee in the Anakin language, but like the only person in history who created a language that thrives today that we know of and have documentation of is Sejong the Great. And as it so happens, the people in the countries who speak this language are the most literate people in the world. One is our ally, one is our enemy. That aside, this dude made this language to give his people literacy. And what's that done? And it's considered linguistically one of the most perfect scientific phonetic languages. Never mind the symbolism that's buried within it. And one of the main reasons, because the king, Sejong the Great, was surrounded by the upper class, the Eastern equivalent of lords and ladies. I'm pretty sure I won't live long enough to figure it all out. But essentially, like, he was surrounded by the upper class, the Eastern equivalent of lords and ladies, and so on. And he knew that those people in the hierarchy up to him were abusing their power. One of the reasons he wanted Sejong the Great, man, he was really great. Like Alexander the Great, you can question because of his history or historicity, or because of what he actually did. But Sejong the Great, like, okay, there's probably shit I don't know about the history, and there's probably things people take objection to, but my guess is what little I know, and you don't need to know, you don't need to know much about Sejong the Great to know he was pretty much, and it just kills me. I mean, everybody on the planet should know about this fucking guy and be like, you were the motherfucking guy. Not because he's Korean, but because he litericized his people so that they could have, I mean, one of the most scientific nations in the world. Well, I'm speaking specifically about South Korea. We'll leave North Korea out of it for now. Never mind, that's who shit's gonna go down with. Or at least that region. The whole China, Russia, Korea region in America, that whole fucking tension, which could be resolved so beautifully with understanding. And that would be the best possible option. But anyway, we'll just pretend it's all South Korea. The biggest thing in the world today, technologically speaking, as a language, is computers, computer programming. And Korean and English, the most, like, diffused, hardest, unscientific language, because it's the most symbolic. People don't realize that. Which also came to rise about the same time as the Korean language. To my mind, and I can't prove it yet, I'll reference it elsewhere, but to my mind, Sejong the Great was in touch with those same folk who made the English language to spread around the world. Why? We'll get to it at some point. Anyway, I'm getting too far off the subject of what I was trying to get to today. Because what I want to get to today is like atemporal evolutions or cyclonic temporal evolutions and power. But anyway, I got to say this about Sejong. One of the reasons he wanted to create the Korean language, and the Korean people are the most literate nation in the world. We live in the most technological, advanced world ever, which is completely dependent upon literacy. And so far as literacy goes, we often consider writing, like linguistics, language, speech, and mathematics. There's also music, everything. So far as literacy goes, we tend to go to language, speaking, writing, and we tend to go to mathematics. These days, much included with computer coding. But anyway, one of the reasons why Sejong the Great wanted to create the Korean language was so that regular, ordinary peasants, like everybody, anybody who had had grief, or anybody who felt miswronged about the people above them who had power over them, about whatever the Eastern equivalent was of their lords and ladies, of their landlords and ladies, like whatever that equivalency was in the East, in that particular region of the, I can't remember the name. It was after, there's the Korean, which Korea comes after, Korean dynasty, their flag-like emblem, well, that's something else, but. And then there was the one that Sejong belonged to. I forget the name of that dynasty. I can't remember, but he wanted the regular, ordinary, everyday people to be able to make like written grievances against the people above them for doing wrong to them. That they could submit higher up to people like Sejong to say, this motherfucker did this. Forget about it. And he's the only historical figure that I'm aware of, and I'm not aware of very much, but I Google fucking like, I'm sitting on the shitter, I'm driving to work, so it's like, I'm interested, I care, you know. It's always about this job. It's always about this mission. It's always about this thing, So, I guess if anyone were to wonder what my qualifications are, even me, because I just had like a very, very, very bad 5-day spout of disbelief and doubt and fear, and it pounded me hard, man. And yeah, the prophets were there too, and they were hammering on me, It tends to be the prophets hammer on me, and then something comes out, and I hope this is one of those things, because it's just like that sword getting pounded and folded over and over again. Like, at some point, this malleability and foldability, at some point, it actually condenses upon something like hard and strong and true, So it's been it's been the worst several days I've had in a very long time. Maybe a year, maybe a year plus. But I'm always inspired by Sejong the Great, who was dying as he created this language. Like, it was clearly his life's work, and working with his daughter, it's just one of the most beautiful stories ever. I mean, in history, in writing. Like, it doesn't need to be myth 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 mythologized, or mythologized. Like, it doesn't need to be that, because it's right there in fucking black and white, right? But then the mythology that you can build onto that, and the inspiration, and like, it's the most powerful. To my mind, Sejong the Great, what he actually accomplished now. There's so many other things, like, and that's the thing too, like, it was this lifetime, this kingship, this kinship, this national, and never mind how that's come down through history, never mind what's to come. And it's so frightful. And I want to hold on to this hope on this side of the fright. Right? Hope is on that side of the fright, no doubt. No doubt. Hope is on that side of the fright. Right? But if we can get the hope on this side of the fright right, and it's like I'm a perfect example. I give up when I'm on this side of the fright. It's like, fuck it. And then the fright comes and then something comes up. That's what's happening today. I had something even bigger before. A few days back. The day after I made my last video. And then shit came fucking tumbling down. So today I have to settle for the hope and the brightness on the other side of fear. I'm looking forward to the day when I can execute the hope on this side of the fear. As that fear broils and cascades down upon me, instead of folding, waiting it for to settle, and then being like, as that fear broils, I look forward. I hope. I do hope. I do hope. Hope. People shit on hope and should, but Hebrews 1:11. Like the hope on this side of fear, where you can fucking blast through it, and really make some fucking difference. Like Sejong, and that's what Sejong. He is the. People talk about FDR. People talk about Churchill. People talk this, that, whatever, but ain't nobody ever did it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I ain't saying nothing bad. I mean, obviously FDR. Come on. The way Sejong did it, man. Nobody has ever done it like that. Now, having that said, there are all kinds of people in power and politics who history might disregard. They say, oh, they lost their chance or whatever. I'll be posting soon a speech that Hillary Clinton gave in Beijing back in the 90s. It was like the fourth United Nations Women's Conference, something like that, in Wairo, Beijing, something like that. And she was all dressed up in her pink Barbie stuff or whatever. And people of this day, even though there's all this supposed tension between the US and China, people won't realize today even that like back then it was even more. Like nobody went to China and she went to fucking China. And she spoke in the vernacular of the day. It might sound a little dated. Before MTV had its urban influence. I'll put it that way to be. That's how do you even say it politically correct? You can't say it. Before the explosion of Ebonics upon the population, which was a good thing. But there's no way to talk about it where it sounds good. I don't know how to talk about it because I'm not up to date, because the terms keep changing so quickly, too quickly. Never minding what was built before us, even as the women hid. People don't realize the way that women hid and actually were the intellectual female women's circles of knowledge and intellect for the last several thousand years have actually been the builders of what we're in. You want to talk about networks and knowing? What do you think in these sewing circles, in these weaving looms, with old women, young women, middle-aged women all working together with their fingers fucking flying, making these perfect, elastic, flexible mathematical patterns, telling stories, weaving geometries this way, that way, this way, that way, while being completely subjugated by their husbands, yet during their day spending time together, looming, knitting, macrameing, stitching. For thousands of years, perfect patterns with a little flaw. Was it a flaw or was it a code? All these codes, all these languages. When we look at the Coptic, when we look at the Coptic texts, and the way these little slashes just represent words and numbers at the same time. And then we look at the stitching, which is also like in I guess in topology, like manifold algebraic topology, multi-dimensional surfaces, which are closely related to crochet and macrame surfaces. Who figured that out first? Women doing it. Lace weaving, all that kind of shit, man. Math, dexterity, softness, precision, surgical precision of weaving these little laces. There's nothing like it. These little needles, this acupuncture. So who else would know better where these lines of force and electricity weave through the body with these needles placed into them? And then the weavers, have you ever looked at any of that old school fucking lace, man? Those Japanese paper cutout fucking art pieces. The precision of the sharpness of the blade or of the pin for the puncture or the slice. Unmatched. And so Sejong empowered his daughter in the creation of this superior scientific language. As Plotinus empowered women in the very day and age when Saint Agnes was burned at the stake, lived, and was decapitated like John. When Iamblichus, student of Plotinus, said that the Logos was born from the intellect, which is just a reinterpretation of the words, though people don't put this part of the puzzle together, that in the beginning was the Word and the Word was God. They fit like fucking glue. And Iamblichus looks like a lamb, and Agnes, her symbol, is the lamb. And people talk about the Lamb of God. Who's the Lamb of God? Saint Agnes. Who's the Lamb of God? The Lamb is the L-am, the I am. But anyway, what I was going to say about Sejong is that, so he creates this thing, right? And he's the only one who knows it and the folk around him. And then it starts to bloom. But the people contemporaneous with him, the people who lived at the time he didn't know it. It's people who came after. So then people who came after knew it, but there were still people around who didn't know it. So in some sense, temporally, if Sejong the Great was here, who created the Korean language, and 50 years later, this group of people, a bigger group of people, knew the Korean language. And then 50 years later, 100 years after Sejong, this amount of people knew the language, but there was still this many people who didn't. Then temporally, or atemporally, a way of thinking about, just a way of thinking about it, is that the people 100 years later who knew the language are more contemporaneous with Sejong the Great than the people who were alive 50 years later who didn't. I don't know calculus like Newton and Leibniz, etc. Euler. So, even though I exist after them, in a sense, in an ideological sense, or an imaginary sense, or an atemporal sense, I exist before them or outside of them. Like, I'm not up to their speed. Like, I'm living in the year 2021, but so far as their knowledge is concerned, I'm not even living in the 1700s. But it's catching up to me, or I'm catching up to it. There's this whirlwind of knowledge. There's this swirl, and we get caught up in it in different ways. Some people exist at the epicenter of a swirl, and some people exist on the peripheries. So I'm on the periphery of that particular kind of knowledge. But I think, as far as just like the average everyday person goes, I'm a little more in tune with like the philosophy of science of it, but like, what the fuck's that mean? Nothing. Unless it reaches people. So the pragmatics of it matter. So what I was going to say, like, that has a little bit to do with the atemporality of prayer. This one's going to go off way off in the left field, but I think some people will get something out of it and do a better job with it if they think about it a little bit, put into their words, your words. The temporality of prayer. To my mind, everything's always praying. There's always this thing, this tension, or this structure, or this balance between the beginning and the end, and free will. Between the first cause, the prime mover, and the Aristotelian final cause. And it's like, what's the final cause? But that's the thing about some of the terms in philosophy, is like, you just got to think about it for a minute. The final, the end, cause. Like, which is to say that the end actually has a causality, which is to say the end has a pull. Like, we're actually being pulled somewhere. It's not just a random, like all these random mutations in biology. They're no more random than like the trials and errors of science that collapses upon products. Beta failed in VHS-1, right? But beta was still good. It worked. It wasn't a failure. So there's all kinds of things that work that don't fail. But like we're being we're being pulled toward we're being pulled toward something, a final cause. So where all those things meet, the unmoved mover. People talk about like the Big Bang or eternal recurrence. It's a tough way to think about it. It's all a tough way to think about it. But if we're thinking about the fact that like we're living in the scientific revolution, even most scientists aren't up to speed. You get a bachelor's, master's, doctorate in some branch of science. What do you really know? There's no unified theory, right? Not to just throw that out as a blanket discreditation of everything. But I guess what I'm trying to combat is the headline, the news article. Scientists say, well, what kind of scientists? Like, an epidemiologist believes in global warming? By what justification? By what series of logic? Most scientists agree. Well, what's a scientist? Are we including political scientists who aren't scientists? Or are we including? Are we? I mean, most. Are we including? You know. Well, for instance, yeah, like Roger Penrose and Penrose and Stuart Ameroff talking about. I forget what it. Uh, Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. They talk about what is it? Spindles. Because most people are talking about neurons, and these guys are talking about. I don't know. They're actually talking about something that like actually connects with reality. God damn it! I can't remember. Microbund? No, not microbundles. What the fuck is it? So spindles. Like the parts of the brain that are actually connected with consciousness. Whatever. Google Google Roger Penrose Stuart Hameroff, right? And they're the only ones talking about it, besides the people who talk to them, about, well, here's something that might actually possess, so it's like this biological, physical thing. So to any of us who can't speak to that, I mean, it is Sir Sir Penrose, you know, and a guy who's deeply, intimately, technically associated with consciousness, Stuart Hameroff. I mean, they're the only ones speaking about something that might actually make sense at a very high level, both medically, scientifically, and mathematically. I mean, guy who made the Penrose tiles. I mean, that ain't nothing, right? You know. But anyway, so if we look at those dudes, like, if we claim to be either empiricists or rationalists, we can't wave that off. We have to deal with it. And if we can't speak to it, what can we speak to? So that's not a challenge of discreditation of anybody who might think that they oppose me. My supposition is that this monologue, pretending to be a dialogue, pretty much should offend most anybody. At the same time, I think it should appeal to most anybody. But I guess it's no secret that I appeal to the concept of the highest principle. Right. And principle might even be the wrong word, but that I appeal to the highest and the deepest, the lowest. At least in theory, and in so much as that theory inhabits me, yet to be fully inhabited, with or by. But I wanted to address that, and so everything I just said in the last 46 minutes has to do with the idea of, even though it might not seem like it, it has mostly to do with the idea of atemporal progressions cyclically through time. So, here's an example, and a lot of people are going to hate me for this, and this might be the very reason why I'm killed if I don't achieve it first on my own with my bad habits. Maybe not. I don't know. I'm just going to say it straight. Think about it. Yeah, boy, I don't know if this is the right time to say it. Okay. I'm going to speak about Islam as we know it mostly today, not Muhammad. Peace be upon him. Like, what I don't trust is translations and all of that. So Islam as we know it today, and this is the only reason why, and this is a fine point of historiography. I think I just made up a word. Sounds smart though. But it's a fine point. Kalal butchery, and kosher butchery. There is no accepted Christian butchery. Why? Because the sacrifice in Christianity is the bread and the wine. Now, Christians, or so-called, or yeah, I don't even want to say so-called, man. And I don't want to harsh upon Jews or Muslims, man, because, like, so many people care so much about so much shit. But, like, symbolically, rationally, whether it's a history or whether it's a story, in the beginning was the Word. The Word is the logos, which is the pattern, the order, the math, the geometry. But the Word is also the story, the intuition. The intuition not as the mythos, but the intuition as part of the logos. Because we too often associate intuition with the mythos, but the mythos is the expression. The mythos has to do with time. M-Y-T-H, flip the T-H-Y-M, time, backwards. Like, the mythos has to do with time, sound, music, stories, art, things that take time to make, things that take time to say, to do, that take air. Right? Photons don't do that, the light. Intuition is part of reason. And we put intuition into the mythos. That's a category error, I think. I'm not sure how much time I have. What I was gonna say, just flat out, man, is that because we put Judaism versus Christianity versus Islam all within the whole Abrahamic tradition thing. It's a big part of the West, the Near East, the Far East. Huge. You got to deal with it, right? Now, to my mind, so logically speaking, so far as it is logical, it's logical to be anti-butcherous. And they say, oh, well, you shouldn't ever be against something, you should affirm something. That's a lie. You sure the fuck should be against shit. In favor of what you're for. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be against shit. So when people talk about affirmations and you should only be positive and not negative, you should sure the fuck be against shit. And the number one thing to be against is butchery itself. Butchery begets butchery. So we're against tribalism. We're against us and them, right? Us versus them, right? We're against that, right? If we're liberal, if we're conservative, it's a little more us, even though conservatism, if you're like me living in America, we associate with American conservatism, never mind the conservatism of other places, liberalism of other places. So one of the things is that the liberals of the world need to come together, and it's happening. But also there's a certain sense, there's a lost sense of conservatism that is good. Because liberalism can go too far, conservatism can go too far. But yet there's this sweet spot we really are trying to get to. And I know that, and I speak high. I'm speaking high and mighty right now, right? Trust me, in the real world, I live like this. Ugh. Trust me. So, thank you, interweb, for this opportunity to get shit off my chest, so I feel like I'm not just. If I don't speak on this machine, I feel like I'm dying. And this is the only thing these days that gives me any life at all. And yeah, I could go out and do this and do that, and I could learn this and I could learn that, but butchery exists. Butchery exists, so there ain't no, man, I've been there. You ain't gonna believe me, and I don't blame you, and I don't ask you to, but I'm fucking telling you, I've been there. Where? There. There. Been there. Just saying. You don't have to believe me. Let me tell you something. I'm just saying on my own behalf, and it could be crazy. I might not even exist for all I know, but I'm saying, if I exist, and if I've ever been anywhere, I've been there. There. Dude. those gates we all wantin', those gates we ain't hating. They're not built yet. They're being built. There's nowhere to go. There will be a place that is gotten to. There will be. There will be a place that is gotten to. But what matters is how many of us get there. And people deride against the ego, but the ego is a misnomer. The ego is a misnomer. It's the persona. People treat the ego as the enemy, but the ego is not the enemy. You must be individuated. Ego is the I. Ego is the I. Ego is the I. Is the I, E-Y-E. The Y. The vertical. The I, the imaginary vertical. What can be? What is the imagination? The imagination, in a sense, is God. Because it battles against free will. And hell is the accumulated error of all free will. Everything has free will. Everything. Fermilab just came up with what was potentially a fifth force. A completely unknown force outside of dark matter, dark energy, dark this, all that shit that's unresolved in physics, which is just about everything. In spite of its incredible efficacy, could that fifth force, now detected, be free will? Why is the world so fucked up? Why has God allowed this? Because God necessitates our free will. So, for instance, everything has free will. Also, superluminalism is discounted. Superluminalism is. My understanding, which is infantile, of like neutrinos is that. No, I thought I'd heard that neutrinos were superluminal. As it turns out, the first experiments that were constructed to try to discern the speed of neutrinos came up with a superluminal, which is forbidden. It's forbidden. I don't know if it's the Copenhagen interpretation. I don't know what it is within popular science that excludes superluminalism. Never mind whether C is a constant in the first place, but they had to retweak the calculations twice just to get the speed of neutrinos sub superluminal. So just to make neutrinos the speed of light, or just below the speed of light, took 2 reworkings of the calculations. That's not like something that normally happens. Usually you have to do that, it's like, y'all fucked. But you can't be superluminal. You can't be outside of relativism, right? So what happened was, these 2 reworkings brought the speed of neutrinos to sub-superluminal speeds. But they're still super relativistic. So according to the popular scientific consensus of the speed of neutrinos, is that they're still super relativistic, which means it has to do with like their mass and their speed and how they're still like traveling faster than they should according to the theory of relativity. But they've been reworked and recalculated so that they're not superluminal, which means they don't go backward in time. For me, this comes back to what I'll be giving some demonstrations. Me, the house painter. I'll be giving some demonstrations on superluminalism pretty soon. But I think I have some good ideas as far as what I call oscillational resolutionism, which basically the simplest way of thinking about it, and God forbid anything be fucking simple, is taking movies of tires rolling on a car and how sometimes they look like they're going backwards, they might look like they're standing still. However that tire moves, depending on the RPMs of the tire and the frame rate of the camera. So those are two things, and it makes it seem all relativistic, but it's not, because it's existing within an absolute framework. So to my mind, it would have to do with that. But yeah, the way they treat neutrinos was super fucked, and it's still super relativistic. So shit's fucked. But most people are just like, oh, okay. It's not superluminal. Can't be time travel, okay. It's still super relativistic, so that makes it almost even worse. They had to rework it twice so that it still broke the model. Okay. Today, class, paycheck. Don't get me wrong. I want my paycheck, man. I'll fudge the rules for my paycheck. You know. It's like, shit's got to be done. There's a deadline. Well, I'll cock this. I won't cock that. I'll tape this. I won't tape that. I'll do this. I won't do that. I'll make it better. I'll make it more better. Or as a guy I work with says, farmhouse perfect. Painting a farmhouse, painting a new house, and it's like, well, you got bug shit everywhere, you got some rot, you got some stink, you got some mildew, this, that, whatever. Sometimes you want to hit it with the concrobium or with the bleach, and sometimes you want to caulk it, but sometimes you want to bondo it, but sometimes you want to epoxy it. Sometimes you want to just stick some glazing into it, or some wood putty, or some water putty. Sometimes you want to sand it, sometimes you don't got time to sand it, because, like, shit's going down tomorrow, man. People coming, you know. Moving trucks are coming. People from out of town are coming. Second house, first house, people are coming. You just got to get that shit done. Got to paint that shit on. Sometimes you got time to prime. Sometimes you don't got time to prime. You know. Sometimes you hit it with the putty. Sometimes you hit it with the Durabond. Sometimes you hit it with the easy sand. Sometimes you hit it with the spackle. Sometimes you hit it with the caulking. Sometimes you just paint on third coat and don't fill nothing, because if it's super duper 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 opaque and flat, shit ain't gonna show. Is it dark in here? I don't give a fuck about the walls look like. You know? They coming tomorrow? I don't care how gritty my fucking trim work is. I don't care how much sand, dirt, grit, shit, whatever's in it. It's just gotta be white, tight, and right. Get that cut line straight. Man, you can fuck up all kinds of shit, but if you get that cut line straight, and everything works out. Not sure where I was going with that. Got off on something. It's 104, but I had another thing to get to. Because it has to do with the next thing I'm doing. By golly, I got to do something. presidents. I think I already brought it up. Yeah, I mean, it's been on my mind like a motherfucker. It's been on my mind for years. Yeah, Hillary Clinton. President. People talk about the Clintons. People talk about the Bushes. People talk about all kinds of shit about conspiracies, and I've been there. I've checked I've checked out shit you can't even find anymore. I checked out shit back on Google Video before. Well, what was it? YouTube who bought Google Video, or Google Video who bought YouTube? But there was shit on Google Video back before YouTube that you can't even find anymore. If you look at my playlists, man, I got deleted it. I'm just saying. I'm sorry I'm saying it like this. I don't know how else to say it. I'm speaking to a part of myself. It's a weird thing because this is a diary. Nobody's watching. Though someday so many will. Which is fucked up. It's fucked up for me to say that. Except for that. It's kinda already not even kinda, man. It's already been shown. I mean, not even shown. I can't even tell you how much I just know this shit's gonna be around. It sucks. It sucks. Like, don't think it's cool, man. It sucks living this way. But it's awesome if we can get to the conclusion. And that's all that matters. Like, there ain't no good way to live today. There ain't. Anybody who's talking about this meditation, that, I'm happy for you if you get there. And you're cool and you're happy and everything's all good. But the truth is, when you open that fucking third eye, when you open shit up, the truth is what comes in is all the psychic knowledge of pain of the world. What does God hear most? You into God? Right? And if you're not, think of the highest principle. Or think of every sentient being. Think of anything with consciousness. Alright, if you're not into God at all, think of everything with eyeballs. And if you're into God, think of every prayer. You think every prayer is mostly like, God, I love you. God, everything's great. God, what a good life. Right? Think of everything with eyeballs. Fuck! Wah! And that's not only just amongst the victims, not just amongst those who are slayed, but amongst the slayers. Imagine how awful it is to be a predator. Imagine how awful it is to be a raper and pillager. Like, rapers and pillagers have masters. Rapers and pillagers, murderers, have masters. Say, you do this, or you don't get fed. You don't get your paycheck. You don't get your, what do they call it, a slab and a room and board, right? You don't get your room and board. You don't get your paycheck. You don't get your booty. You don't get your fun. You don't get your enjoyment. You don't get your spoils of war. You don't get your profit. You don't get your interest. You don't get what's coming to you unless you do this. Like, to be a perpetrator is an awful, 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 awful price to pay. And much sadness and like forgiveness must be given to perpetrators. Must. Because they're still part of a system. They still have overlords. And they've become butcherists out of necessity, and oftentimes out of necessity of the want of feeding their family, or once again being with their family after having been departed. And that comes to the whole idea of like power, kings, queens, presidents, prime ministers. So soon I'll be making a Hillary Clinton video. I talk about her a lot, right? There are reasons for that. Someday I'll read the essay I wrote back in the day that explains it all. It might be a while off, but people hate her. Some people love her, but most of the people love her who love her I quote unquote hate. Like there ain't never been any one single person on this fucking planet that I've come across who has ever gotten Hillary Clinton right, ever, except for me. And her. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, and her. Yeah, right. No, I'm the one who got it right and she didn't, right? No. But in some sense, she was barking up the wrong tree because she was barking up the right tree because she's ahead of her time. Why? Because she wrote It's a Village, man. And listening to her read her own audiobook is torturous. But there's a quote in there that just has it fucking spot on. I mean, right to the fucking bullseye. Like the one dart through history that fucking nails the 20th century, right? Or the turn of the 20th century. The age of Aquarius. Is when she says, people get, and I'm paraphrasing, but like people give lip service to children and then treat them like garbage. Yes, exactly. Exactly. And then when she went to Beijing dressed up like a Barbie doll, which could be ridiculed after the fact, but like, it's also saying like, because all these like slave laborers in China, they're making Barbie dolls, man. Barbie dolls, pink Barbie dolls and pink Corvettes. Barbie dolls with jobs. Barbie dolls with stuff. And all these women laborers putting shit together, looking at these Barbie dolls. And then here comes Barbie. And what does Barbie say? Now, you got to think about it like that. You got to think about like layers of meaning. And you got to think about world leaders as constructing layers of meaning. So in the place where all these Toys for America are built, where the people who build them can't afford them, and especially as women in a place where women are subjugated. Bad! Even worse than fucking America. Oh, how can you say that? Because it's fucking true. Here comes Barbie, and what does Barbie say? I'll leave that for another time. When Hillary Clinton went to Beijing in her Barbie doll fucking uniform as First Lady, man. It's like if you reduce her whole entire life to that one fucking speech, that would be enough. And I don't mean to do that to her or anyone else. And I also understand, like, people will be like, well, what about this? What about that? What about, what did they call it? Clinton Gate, or I can't remember what they called it. Whitewater, or I can't remember what they called it, but all the shit, the Clintons and this and that, and what about all the murders and all this and that, and all the conspiracy theories, and what about the blandness, and, she's drinking wine at this inauguration thing, or whatever. It's like, let me get this into your fucking head, man. Well, I shouldn't say it like that, because I'm trying to get it into my head. And, yeah, the last 5 days have just been fucking brutal. And I'm a drunk. And if I weren't, I would have already offed myself, probably, so. Thanks for the vino. And I don't always want to be. I want to recover or reform, but that's also part of like a little bit of the false idea of recovery. Oh, everything's fine now. I went through the 12 steps. I'm going to go to heaven. Everything's great. No. There's a problem to be resolved. There's an equation to be solved that's yet to be solved. And that's peace. And you gotta be a brutal motherfucker to fight for peace. And all these empaths are killing themselves and are being killed off by the viciousness of the world. And all these empaths don't realize, like you, that you're the answer, that you actually know the truth. And you might not have the words or the equations for it, but like, you understand that the world is a murderous, butcherous fucking place and it shouldn't be. That's the answer. That's the answer. Stop killing shit. Stop butchering. Stop blood spilling. That is, it sounds so naive, yet that is the answer. That's the answer. Egyptians barely ate any meat. My assumption is they allowed it. Those who didn't eat any meat allowed it in small doses as an act of tolerance, certainly not of mandate. It's also worth noting that the Egyptians, as Africans, and like Moses, now Moses hid among the Egyptians, right, as an Egyptian. So they must have been the same color. Egyptians and the Jewish people must have been of the same color, or at the very least, if the Jews of the Egyptian era of the Bible could well have been of mixed melatonin. Like, Moses must have been of the same color as the Egyptians in order for him to have blended in and been accepted and not outcast outright. Anyway, so he was a high priest, man. A high priest of people who made beers of very low alcohol content. Beers that didn't have hops but had amaranth. Beers that didn't have hops but had yarrow. Beers that were much more like a kombucha. Of amaranth, high in iron. And people say if you're a vegan or a vegetarian that, oh, well, you got to be worried about your iron. Amaranth takes care of that quick. there's so much iron in amaranth that amaranth and also arugula. Well, spinach too. But there's so much earthiness in amaranth that it tastes like mold. It's hard to eat. It's hard to become accustomed to. But, so if you're anemic and you're vegan, or if you're attempting to be vegan, or if you want to become vegan, just suck it up and eat that fucking amaranth, man. Overboil it and use it as an ingredient. Don't eat it alone. Put it in your rice, put it in your quinoa. Make stews with eggplant. If you're cooking quinoa or wild rice, always add more water than they say. Make more like stews and porridges. And yeah, add amaranth. It will help. It will help clean out your lower intestine. It will help with anemia. I'm not a doctor, I'm just saying. This is what I've experienced. So, free speech on that shit. But anyway, no matter what ruler you are, good or bad, you are a murderer in chief. And if you're the president or the secretary of state of the most powerful nation in history, you're the murderer in chief of the world. So when people are like, this conspiracy, this person did that person did this, and it's like, it's good. It's good that you recognize the conspiracy. It's good that you recognize the patterns, right? But make no mistake, whether you do or don't recognize the patterns, that your dinner date or your video game challenge or for me it's supper. Every day when I get up, I'm like, what's for supper? These things don't outweigh the truth, which is that we live in a world that eats itself erroneously. We live in a world that respires reciprocally. And in some cases, ingestion, eating, is fair, balanced. But mostly is not. But we live in a world where eating could be constructed fair, balanced, without blood. The president is the murderer-in-chief of the world. I was going to bring up my Hillary Clinton painting, but oh, fuck it. Like, love her or hate her, right? Love her or hate her. Love her or hate her, she was running as was Trump, as was Biden, as was her husband, as was George Bush, Sr., Jr., Reagan, Carter, Ford, Nixon, Kennedy, Johnson, and so on, and so on, and so on. Like, despite being leaders of the free world, they're also murderers in chief. The highest priests of death. Now, what if they're also good people who don't want to kill? What would you do? What would you do? How do you end butchery? Could you step into that office and butchery is not? The only way we kill butchery is on an individual level. And the number one way we kill butchery, despite all the butchery in the world of peoples, of still existent slavery, underground human trafficking markets, underground human trafficking, smuggling, human smuggling, all that shit. The number one way we can affect the entire cascade, the philosophical cascade of butchery, begins and ends with us eating flesh. Period. Philosophically, logically, rationally, politically, like begets like. If you stop eating flesh, you stop hating people. Now, the militant vegans are a little bit on the other side, like, oh, y'all motherfuckers get all these things. But if you're hating on everything, you gotta put yourself in the position of the president. You're the president. You're the sovereign. You're the president. You're the murderer in chief. All these murderers want to murder each other within governments, within armies, within established UN recognized armies, and then also within established, unrecognized, and very fucking real mobs, mafias, gangs. When you're electing a president, what the fuck you think you're electing, man? You're electing, in this day and age, because we're murderous. Because we're murderous. When we elect a president, we're electing the murderer in chief. Until we become anti-murderous. There will always be a panoply of murderers in chief. Today it's an American murderer in chief. Tomorrow it might be another one. So even the most moral person in the world, if you're living today in this world and you're the most moral, good, perfect, godly person in the world, even Jesus, in Jeebus's day, didn't kill butchery. Now, but that's what comes in to the whole cyclonic time effect, because that is the best story. Why? Religiously, because it requires no sacrifice, because it kills the idea of sacrifice. Yet in that position, at that time, sacrifice was not killed. So it goes for the politicians, so it goes for those who run this shit, is that until we become unmurderous, murderer will exist. And specifically, so long as we kill vertebrates for food, murderousness amongst people will prevail. There will be no. I'm just telling you. You know, take. I'd like to say take it or leave it, but like, I'd rather say prove it to yourself. Explore these ideas where they're uncomfortable, and they're very, very uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable right now. I've been uncomfortable for days, years, my whole fucking life. Why? Because I'm empathic. Why am I uncomfortable? Like, why am I uncomfortable? I'm uncomfortable because, like, I killed shit when I was a kid. I killed animals, you know? Like, oh, you murderer! You vicious person. Yeah, you're right. Just like you. Eating a hamburger. Oh, that's different. No, it's not. It's not. Sorry for being so theatrical and so propagandy and, like, you know, sorry for being so, like, harping on the. Sorry for trying to say it like I know it too much, but I guess that was the other thing I wanted to get to, is that, yeah, presidents are murderers and chiefs, and whether they make us feel good or feel bad, like, we got some fucking work to do. And the work we got to do primarily is to not be murderous or butcherous and to cut up flesh and spill blood. That's it.